Hello, my name is Dr. Olivia and I'm a consultant in the NHS in the UK. And I talk about life as an international medical graduate in the UK and give some tips about how to maneuver through these steps towards becoming a consultant. So if you're new, welcome. Thank you so much for stopping by. And if you've been here before, if it's not your first time and you should love to all the other videos, thank you so much again and welcome back. So last weekend, you guys were not feeling my guilty pleasure weekend video. You can go back and check this out if you haven't seen it yet. But this weekend, we're back on track. We're back on a work weekend. So today we're going to start off with the first step that I had to take in terms of coming to the UK to work, and that was passing the IELTS exam. So it's the International English Language Testing System exam. Okay, many of you would have heard about this exam before via different avenues, for example, for academic reasons. For some of you, you may actually have never ever heard the word before, but you're thinking, do I even have to do this exam as somebody trying to come to the UK? And that's an important first step to think about. Do you have to do IELTS? So as a doctor trying to come to work to the UK, first step is setting an account up on the GMC website. So on the General Medical Council website, register. And one of the first things that they would ask you for is your proof of the ability to speak or to engage with persons in the English language. So not everybody has to take the IELTS. There is a way that you can get out of doing the exam if you have enough documentation or enough proof that you've worked in an area or studied in a country where English was the predominant language. So I studied predominantly in English, and I also worked in a country where English was the main spoken language. However, because I had a 2-month break between my internship year and my SHO year, so just because of, I think it was probably wasn't even 2 months, 6 weeks to 7 weeks, I had that gap, and therefore I didn't have a 2-year continuous period of working in an English setup, as it were. And so I had to take the IELTS exam. So you can have a look at the website. It will show you the forms that you need to download in terms of getting the references from your university as well as from your current place of work. And if you're able to successfully fill those out and prove that you've been studying or working in an area for at least the last 2 years, which predominantly is an English-speaking environment, then you may not have to do IELTS. That's a very important thing to consider. So before you watch this video, although I still want you to watch the video, but before you sign up for an exam that you may not have to do, please look carefully into the website and see whether you are actually able to get out of this very first step. But for some of you, you've already been there, you've registered, and you have to do the IELTS. Now, some of you may have come through this video not via the medical field, because many persons internationally have to do IELTS for various reasons. But as part of the GMC requirements, it is an academic must. So with the IELTS, the rules for the GMC currently is that, or the rules are, number one, that you have to have an academic IELTS with an overall grade of 7.5. I'll break down the grading system in a little bit. And you must have at least a score of 7 in each of the 4 main domain areas. Okay, so the 4 main domain areas that are tested are listening, reading, writing, and speaking. So I'll be going through each of these very briefly and highlighting the steps that I took and also a few pointers. What I will say from the onset is that although there are 4 main domains, that reading is the absolute most important domain because it carries through in each of the sections, and if you make mistakes, like with all exams, But particularly in this one, if you make mistakes on the specifics of the instructions, then you are heavily penalized. So that's why I would say reading is probably the most important thing to focus on. And I would definitely say to do the practice sessions, because you've come so far in your career, you've spent all this money already, you've gotten through medical school, and now you're just trying to advance your career. So doing practice questions is an absolute must. And I will link some of the websites at the end, but the main websites to consider would be the original source. So the IELTS main website and the British Council IELTS website. Okay, so now I will go through the 4 main areas, and I'll start off with listening, because I actually found that listening was the hardest of the 4 for me. Starting off with the listening section, and one of the things to highlight is that for the GMC registration, to take the IELTS for GMC, it has to be paper-based, in person. So there are 2 formats. There's a computer-based and a paper-based. And I had to do the in-person exam. And that's important, especially for the listening part of it, because you have some extra time doing the in-person exam where you can transfer your answers onto the exam paper. So you've got 30 minutes to listen to 4 conversations. Okay, so during the 30 minutes, you will hear 4 separate conversations, and you will have 40 questions to answer in that time. The 4 conversations can vary, but usually it starts off with number 1, a lifelike conversation. For example, somebody sending an item overseas and they're having a discussion over the phone with the operator on the other end asking about the item that is being sent overseas. The second conversation is a real life monologue. For example, somebody telling you about their job or their flat and giving descriptive information. The third conversation is an academic conversation. So for example, 2 university students or 2 professors talking about something to do with university life. And then the 4th conversation is a academic monologue. So it's more like a professor giving a short lecture about a particular specialist area. Okay, and the good thing is that the questions tend to follow along with the conversation. So for the first conversation, you would have questions 1 to 10, and as the conversation flows, the questions usually flow in the same order. So question number 1 would be about something at the beginning of that conversation. So that makes it easier, and that makes it more helpful for sure. I've found that the conversations tend to be more complicated towards the end. So conversations number 3 and 4, I will focus a little bit more on later on in terms of how to go about looking at those questions. But also just in terms of the types of questions and answers that you get. So we have the 4 conversations that we mentioned, but in terms of the questions that they ask and the answer format, they will come in various formats, and I'll just go through them and put a picture hopefully on the side. So the first one is to complete a form. The second one is multiple choice, which we're all used to. The third one is short answer questions. And then you may have matching. So you have a list from A to E, and then you have to match to the correct answer. And the 5 is labeling a diagram. For example, like a picture of a flat or a picture of a box, and you have to label using the information that you've heard, giving the correct labels on there. And then the last one is to complete a note. So I can go through these in a bit more detail. So before we go into the various examples, I just wanted to quickly highlight the table showing the IELTS listening scores. So the table, hopefully I can put on the side somewhere. You can see the number of correct answers that you need to equate to the various band scores. So to get a score of 9, you would have to get 39 to 40 answers correct. So you do have to do very well in this exam to get a high banding score, which makes sense because they're trying to ensure that everybody has the highest level of being able to engage in English to be able to work in the environment that is needed. And also, I wanted to also say that sometimes if your overall score doesn't necessarily neatly fit into a 0.5 band, it's rounded up to the nearest 0.5. So if your score is 6.1, your overall score would be 6. Okay, so that's the way the banding system works. So now that we've said that, I just want to highlight some of the examples. Okay, so this first one, it's a short answer question. And the main thing I wanted to highlight in this one is that, and I mentioned about the reading part being so important. So for example, this says, for your answers, write no more than 3 words and or a number for each answer. And you have to be so careful with this, because if you write down 4, 5, 6 words, you may not get the answer correct, and you will be penalized. So you have to be very, very careful with the structure. And if it says 3 words and or a number, you can include a number, because sometimes people forget that. So you can write down, if it says 2 words and a number, 5,000 years ago is still correct, because that's 1 number and 2 words. So just being careful about reading the instructions, okay? And also you have about 20 seconds to 60 seconds to read through all the questions before the listening starts. So that is where the speed reading comes in, and just to sort of browse through and see what information that you need when you're listening to each of the conversations. Okay, and I'll go through an example of a listening task here. So this one says that it's a customer quotation, so you'll get a conversation, for example, for somebody who, let's see if we can get the actual question. So it says you'll hear a telephone conversation between a customer and an agent at a company which ships large boxes overseas. And this is what it looks like. And while the person is collecting that information, you will have to fill in the various bits on the form. For example, the address, the postcode. And one thing to note as well, so if they've given you an address or anything in terms of the listening, if they've given you that information and they've spelled it out, be sure that your spelling is exactly what was given to you in the audio. Okay, so if they've spelled out a name, and even if it's a word and they've spelled it maybe not in a familiar way to you, use whatever spelling that they've used in the audio, because that again will give you points. It will give you the correct mark at the end of the session. And if they've, and don't change, don't use synonyms, don't change or shorten words. For example, if they've given a full, if they've said this person is wearing a yellow raincoat today, and they've said, what is this person wearing? You have to write down yellow raincoat. So don't just write down, rain or something, or yellow overall. It has to be exact and it has to be specific. So that's something to keep in mind as well. And I'll just go through a few of the other examples. So with the matching, this is probably one of the more usual matching questions that we would see in a regular exam, where you have a box with options from A to E, F, and then you have questions where you have to choose one of the options in the box. So that's a typical matching type question. But then you can also have the matching type question where it is either A, B, or C. Either it's yes, no, or maybe. And then you have to listen quite carefully to find out if the answer to your question is yes, no, or maybe. In this one, it doesn't say yes, no, or maybe. So don't write down yes, no, or maybe. But just write down the letter corresponding to what I would say is yes, no, or maybe. Okay? And yeah, so be very, very careful with all of those things. Write down the letters and not a word answer if that is specified. Okay, so one of the important things about the listening section, which I sort of touched on at the beginning, but I'll mention here again, is that especially for the third and fourth conversations, that the answer doesn't necessarily straight away jump out at you like it does in the first and second conversation. So I've put up an example of a sentence completion for a listening sample task. For example, you hear the conversation. It says, studying with the Open University demanded a great deal of. Sometimes somebody may allude to something in the conversation. They might say, you may need a small amount of patience. And you may be tempted to write down the word patience because it's alluding to something that you may need. But then they may go on to further say, but you need a great deal. Or they might not use the word great deal, but they might use a synonym. They may say, but you need a lot more discipline. So that is where the comprehension and dissection skills come in, and transferring your answer down onto the paper. So this is where I would normally write down my notes on the side. So I would write down, you need a little bit of patience and then a lot of discipline. And then when you read the question and you realize what they're asking for, then you can go back and transfer the one that you think is the most suitable answer. So please, 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 please keep that in mind, especially for the third and fourth conversation. Okay, so now moving on to the reading task. So I think that the reading section was quite enjoyable. I like reading naturally, but also it gives you the opportunity to go back and not only check your answers, but to check your comprehension, to read again. Whereas the listening, you only have the one chance. But for the reading, you can go back and see if what you've gathered from whatever's been given to you makes sense. Okay, so you have 60 minutes. You have three sets of information given to you. Some of them can be longer, but you have 40 questions in total to answer based on the three pieces of information that have been given to you. So I will highlight a reading example, and similar, before we go through the example, similar to the listening, the number of answers corresponds to your band score if you haven't, and it's a very similar split as well. Okay, so with the reading, the questions come about in a slightly different format, but there are many similarities. So you have the multiple choice, sometimes choosing one answer, sometimes you can choose more than one answer if they're all correct, or if more than one is correct. You can have a true and false question, you have a table completion and a summary completion. So I thought that the reading part of the test was very similar to secondary school reading comprehension in English, where you've been given something to read, and for example you have to go back and write a summary of what you've just read. But this one, they sometimes give you the summary, but then you have to add in words which may not be in the original paragraph or in the original script, but you can choose words out of a list, which I think is quite helpful. So this is what an example of a completion of a summary looks like based on paragraph that had been given before. So you can have a little look and see. On the computer test, you can drag up the answers, but on the written exams, you either have to write down the word or the letter that corresponds to the answer. So this is a table completion form of the question and answer, and it was a text giving information about various types of beetles, I believe, and they've formulated it into a nice table that you can go back in and pick out the information that you need, or again, synonyms corresponding to what is available in the answers given. Okay, so that's a summary, the table, the matching form. So I think the reading section was manageable, definitely. Definitely better than the listening section. And then you move on to the writing section, which can be another very tricky section. My first tip for the writing section is please do not use your doctor's handwriting in the writing section, because the people need to be able to read what you've just written. And I think even for myself, that was something that may have contributed to a slightly lowering of my marks, because I don't know if they were able to read exactly what I tried to put down on paper. The second thing about the reading section is that you should not overcomplicate things, because some of us love a good essay, and we can go above and beyond, but they're just trying to make sure that you can use the language in a very succinct way, actually. So going overboard too much, especially with the detail and the length, it can be probably a little bit annoying for them as well, because they just want to tick their box to say that you've been able to do X, Y, and Z. And so what is the X, Y, and Z that they want to see? Let us see, what have we got here? So it will be in 2 tasks. So you have 60 minutes. I can't find the exact picture, but I'll find it in a minute. You have 2 tasks. One is 20 minutes and one is 40 minutes. The first one is usually they've given you a graph or tables, and then you have to summarize the findings. Because it's an academic test, you have to explain the graph or explain the table. And for persons who have been in a job where they've been using Excel spreadsheets all day long, this is easy peasy. For other persons who have not been engaged so much with using descriptive graphs in a very real sense in their job, this may be a little bit more challenging. And the second question is about, it's usually like an argumentative essay type question, where they ask you for your points for or against a particular topic, and you have to give your reasons, and that is 40 minutes. The first question, they would say it's at least 150 words. So I would say if they've said at least 150 words, to stick to between 150 to 200 words. For the second question, they've said, okay, 250 words. I would go to 250 or 250 to maybe 350 words. But you have, again, the reading comes in, because sometimes it says use no more than 150 words. And so you have to be very careful. Okay, if it says use no more than 150 words, please do not go more than 150 words. Again, for the argumentative essay. But sometimes it says use no less than. Okay, so that is an important distinction to make. If it says use no less than 150 words, I would try to stick like 50 words between 150 to 200 words for the first question. For the second one, if it says use no less than 250, again, I would use 250, maybe going up to 300, just a bit over, but I wouldn't stretch it out to like 400 or 500 words, because I think it's a little bit tiring. Okay, So now that we've gone through that, here is what they want. Okay, so you can see for the first task, they want accuracy of information because it's usually a graph or table, something with statistics on there. So they want accurate information. They want an overview or summary, highlighting key features or stages, and supporting your detail with the data that is in there. And for the second one, if they ask, what is your view on, they probably won't ask about a war, but if they ask your particular view on a topic, they want to see what your overall view is. It's like the Miss World competition. They ask you a question, they want the answer to that particular question. They will get a 300 words, but ultimately they want to know what your thoughts are about that particular point. Okay, so you have to make that clear. And then you have to maybe choose about 3 main points. Very, very, not basic, but simple to understand, to follow, and to support these points with information, whether it be statistics or personal information or stories related. Okay, and to summarize at the end. So it is simple in that sense. I think sometimes people get carried away. I probably did. And the final bit of the exam is the speaking section. So for some people that may happen on the same day. For others, it may be a week later from when you've done your first section of the exam, including your listening, your writing, and your reading sections. The speaking section I found the most fun. Clearly, I love to speak quite a lot. And so I enjoyed having a conversation with the person on the other end of the table. And it's quite a personable, pleasant conversation. So it's usually 10 to 15 minutes from recollection. They would start off asking you about yourself and some details about yourself. And when you've been asked those questions, try to give a little bit more detail. So if they've asked, where did you grow up? You can say, I grew up in this town. It was a small town. It was a quiet town. There weren't very many people there. You can use words to describe the town, not just to say, I grew up in X. Okay, so using descriptive words, descriptive phrases, just going to a little bit more detail is always helpful because it's carrying out a conversation like what we're doing right now. Part of it is practicing. So you can do like, what I'm doing exactly right now, and you can turn on your camera and practice making a YouTube video and do a Q&A about yourself. Look up Q&A questions on YouTube, on Instagram, and answer the Q&A. I have a Q&A video, by the way. Go check that out. So the first section is just a chat about yourself, and then they may ask a follow-up question. For example, tell me about an item which is very important to you, and they would expect you to say why it's important, where did you get it from. And then the third part of it is them asking you a bit more detail about the second part of the question. So they may just do a little bit more digging, a little bit more prompting, and the less prompting they have to do, the better, because if you give a lot more detail, then it's always a sign that you're comfortable in carrying out a conversation in English. And I will show you the exam mark scheme for the speaking part of it. And you will see, so they're checking for fluency. See, talking at length. I didn't make it up. Talking at length. Talking without pauses or hesitations. That happens. I mean, it happens to me. It happens to all of us. So it isn't automatic that you will carry on for like 5 minutes without taking a natural pause, unless you've planned out in every single detail your perfect answer, and that is impossible. Even if you've tried practicing all the different speaking questions on the day, they may ask you something different, and then you may be like, oh my goodness, I didn't practice this. What do I do now? So just talking naturally and with your natural pauses is fine. But if you're having a whole minute just to yourself to think, oh, what am I going to say? Then that's going to take away some points. Okay. Being able to be understood. So a lot of us have accents that are not from the UK, the US, and so we may have to speak a little bit more slowly. I hope you understood majority of this video because I naturally tend to speak quite quickly. But for the exam, if you know that your accent is quite heavy and the pronunciation of the words may be different or difficult to understand for persons within whichever country that you're taking the exam, or just for somebody who's not from your local area, try to slow it down just a little bit. So don't do like me and speak very, very quickly, but being able to be understood is of utmost importance in the exam and also working in a region that you're not particularly used to. Okay, and you can see the rest of it down in the picture below. It's not going to be 100%, and don't beat yourself up about it. If you make a few errors, that's okay. It happens. And I've always said errors happen in life. That's life. You know, just continuously doing the practice and doing as well as you possibly can, giving it your best shot is all you can do on the day. Okay, so as I mentioned, I'll put some of the websites down in the description, or if I can't put it in the description, I'll put it down in the comment section and you can check them out. But there are lots of websites that do free IELTS exam training, but I would suggest using the main IELTS UK Cambridge website as well as the British Council website. And I wish you all the best in your IELTS exam and I hope you smash it. Take care. All the best, Dr. Olivia. Bye.